All right, what's up, everybody? Geoff Ebbs here with FIT, and with our first installment of a series we're going to do called 15 with FIT. This is going to be a bi-weekly power block of topics that strength and conditioning coaches, performance practitioners, things that those people care about. We're going to bring some experts on, some of the best in the business to work through some topics. And our very first person we're having is Alex Pacitti. Alex, what's up?
What's up? How we doing?
Good, man. Alex is the head strength and conditioning coach for the Capital City Go-Go in the NBA G League with the Wizards organization. And Alex has been a great friend of mine for a long time now. So, Alex, great to have you. Thanks for doing this, dude.
Of course, man. Yeah, we go way back, so I was excited when you gave me the call. Happy to chat, brother.
How's the beginning of the year going so far? You guys are just getting it rolling, right?
Yeah, just started up. Things are going well, and looking forward to this year.
Yeah, man, excited for you. Um, with you guys getting into it, obviously long season ahead. I want to talk about kind of longevity and load management today. That's kind of going to be the topic for the next 15 or 20 minutes or so. And with that in mind, I just kind of want to hear where your brain goes when you think about, the idea of training for outputs versus training for sustainability and longevity. Like, where does your mind go when you consider that? And what are some maybe monitoring strategies that you use to help facilitate that?
Yeah, I mean, I think just in general, like it's important to have key performance indicators. I call them KPIs for short, just to kind of help, be your compass in terms of, what are you trying to accomplish? Where do you want to go with your athletes right now and then in the future, right? So what are you like, actually building towards? And a lot of these, like most strength and conditioning coaches already do to a certain point, and those are more of like the output metrics that we typically think of, how strong did we get? How fast did we get? How well can we change direction? What's our vertical jump? Things like that. And I think those things are the bread and butter of what we do. Extremely important. Probably what we're, most known for to people outside of our profession. And I think there's a minimum barrier of entry, right, to be able to be on the same playing field as other people. So output metrics are important. It's important how fast we are, right? If we're not fast enough, if we're too slow, it's going to put us behind on, the court, the field, the ice, wherever we're at. If we're too weak, we're not going to be able to, keep up with the competition. But once you've reached a certain, acceptable point of that, not necessarily saying we're done working on those things. It's also important to consider, especially once you get into season, um, what you call, more health-based metrics or longevity metrics. And that's what really looking at, how is a person doing what they're doing? What is the cost? And how long can they continue to repeat and do those things over the course of a season, over the course of several years, right? If you look at college, like, if you're there for 4 years these days, can you do that freshman, sophomore, junior, senior, fifth year? So I think it's important to be able to identify and separate or delineate your KPIs for outputs and your KPIs for more like longevity.
Yeah, man, and I love to use that word cost, right? I mean, this is something you and I have talked about, a lot over the years. And I think, sometimes with the skill set, certainly that somebody like you has, I wonder, like, can you ever see some things coming down the pike sometimes that are, maybe obvious to you, but maybe tough for other members of the staff to see? Like, how do you navigate that when you can kind of anticipate that something's coming, and then trying to explain that to other athletes, stakeholders? Is that something that happens?
Yeah, I mean, I think we used to have conversations all the time, right? We say there's no such thing as a free lunch, right? And that just means, you can do certain things, but there just might be an associated cost with that, right? You can play, every single minute of a game, but there's going to be an associated cost with that after the game, right? You might need longer time for recovery. You might need a reduced intensity training stimulus on the back end. You might need, greater recovery modalities, whatever it is. So I think the biggest thing is again, going back to what I was saying about KPIs, establishing normative ranges for those KPIs, right? And continuing to touch on those and monitor those, right? You decide with, the people that you're working with, how frequently you're going to do that, based on training residuals, based on, the schedule of the season. But it's definitely important to have some touch points. I don't know who made this phrase famous, but I hear a lot of people say it. What gets measured gets managed, right? So if you want to manage those things, then you have to make sure you're consistently enough measuring them throughout the course of the year. And then from there, I think it all comes down to establishing a consistent framework of performance with the people that you work with, using similar language and establishing language with the people that you work with. So, when you say something or they say something, you know exactly what they're talking about. The athlete knows exactly what you're talking about. So when you have those conversations, right, you talk about strength, power, fatigue, whatever it might be, they know exactly what you're talking about, right? And those things tend to happen organically, but it's important to kind of make the time to discuss those things. But now as we go, and we're monitoring load, we're going through the course of the year. You may see some things that go outside the norm of those KPIs. It might be an output metric, right? It might be, something with their vertical jump. It might be, more of a health longevity metric. It could be something that you just, coach's eye, practitioner's eye, that you see that doesn't look right, right? Someone's, running with a little bit of a limp. Their energy is different when they walk into a room. Their personality might be different. Whatever those things are, things that are outside the norm, that's when you might want to look at some of those KPIs and hopefully get ahead of those things. Hopefully you're not getting to those things to the point where it's, too late to do anything about. Um, but from there, you have to have standard operating procedures or breakout interventions kind of already established, so you know what to do when you reach those situations, right? It's not one of those things where you want to be throwing stuff at the wall, seeing what works, or just randomly guessing. Ideally, you can take like a scientific approach where you know the variables and you can manipulate the variables. So you know what caused the stimulus for positive or negatively, when you have an intervention, when you see something that concerns you, in terms of, load monitoring or whatever it might be.
Yeah, man. So there's so much good stuff in there. And like, I love how, I think one of the things that you intuitively do, and I know this about you, but like you kind of immediately jumped into this place where you talked about some of the more objective, measurable KPIs. And then kind of immediately brought in the coaching eye too, which I think is a question that a lot of people will bring up and something that's kind of a big discussion where it's, the data isn't everything, but how invested in the data are we? And you
Hmm.
had kind of brought up that practical and experiential part of it, which is largely based on a relationship you might have with the athlete or the client. Um, and the other thing I want to tie it into a little bit is programming, and this can obviously be in a non-specific way, but I know that you're more of a vertical integration programmer. I'm a vertical integration
Hmm.
programmer, and you mentioned training residuals a minute ago, and I think that's um, a commonly accepted term that sometimes is used a little generically. But
Hmm.
what are training residuals to you? And then kind of combine that with the way that you use vertical integration programming, and like how does that give you that really depth level of control that I know you have?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. First of all, for those of you who don't know what vertical integration is, one, it was popularized by a guy named Charlie Francis. Definitely someone who, pretty big figure in the field of strength and conditioning, was a strength and conditioning coach for um, some people in the track and field community. And all vertical integration really is it's rotating the emphasis of qualities that you're focusing on, within a session or within a phase, but really touching all of those things, right? So it's kind of like a, uh, total approach where you might be, working on strength, you're working on power, you're working on hypertrophy. All of these things may be present, but the time or percentage of the program allocated to each of those qualities varies. And the one that gets the biggest piece of the pie is kind of like a slide in. Like if you picture like a calendar as we kind of work our way across time, maybe it's strength here, power, hypertrophy, right? And then the next phase, like everything kind of shuffles up and strength goes down to the bottom, right? We just spent, 4 or 5 weeks maybe making that our main priority. Now we have something where we're allocating a little bit more of our time and resources towards maybe building up power or, you choose the quality. That doesn't mean we forget about strength or we just kick it by the wayside. But again, the time and energy that we allocated, the emphasis in our program, um, it's just not our main concern or biggest emphasis. So I like to use a vertical integration approach, in a weekly mesocycle, and just kind of throughout the year. And for me, what that does is it allows us to make sure we're not, missing any buckets. Now, you might have cases that get super specific where, it's like, all right, this athlete needs to work on this one thing or these two things, and that's what's going to kind of take them, over the edge or get that extra 1% out of their performance. And that's a little bit different scenario. But I'd say for, you know, majority of athletes, that vertical integration approach, they can, afford to get better at all of those qualities. Like none of them are A plus plus in all of those things. They might be, B plus, A minus in some things, and they might not need as much time, and that you can kind of tinker with, which qualities you continue to put at the top of your priority list. And maybe one of them doesn't always reach it all the way to the top, or maybe it's every few months you touch on that thing. But that's kind of the general gist of vertical integration. Lets me touch on all the qualities that I want throughout the week, make sure we're not missing anything. And then to your point about training residuals, so that just tells you how long it takes a quality to detrain or how frequently you need to train a quality to at least maintain that, right? So if you look at, speed and power, uh, that quality starts to detrain after about, I think it's like 5 to 7 days. So like pretty much we want to be touching on something speed and power every week, right? At least once a week if you want to maintain that throughout the year. So if you look into, really builds that quality up, maybe you want to do that a little bit more frequently. If you're, a very novice athlete in terms of physical development, maybe once a week is enough, right? You kind of have to again monitor your KPIs and track their improvement over time. But to at least maintain that throughout the year, and this is where like in-season training strategies, it's really helpful to know residuals. It's like, all right, if I don't want to lose that, if I don't want to get slower in season, I should probably touch on, sprints, power work, med ball throws, plyos, whatever it is, whatever your actual training strategies are for that quality, probably touch on those things at least once a week.
Well, you gave me an article years ago from Evan Pecan that was a blog that he had written, and it was on the limiter bridge philosophy. And that's something I've really taken to. And you would just use kind of the pie analogy with your vertical integration programming, and we're kind of, dividing up the pie, and it makes me think about, like how big is the biggest piece? And, when you said that, I kind of went right back to that article where it's like, well, what's the rate limiting factor to performance,
Mhm.
based on the task that we're trying to improve is, and then, how do we most quickly bridge the gap between where we are and where we're trying to go? And that's
Mhm.
probably going to be the biggest piece of the pie. And I think that still fits nicely into the vertical integration approach, right? Because we still have the opportunity to touch on a lot of different things. Just kind of dictates maybe how things are divvied up a little bit.
For sure, for sure. And that's where the testing becomes really important, right? If you want to identify what that rate limiting factor is, right, your testing is going to help, like it should, ideally, if you have a good testing battery, and all caps, highlighted, kind of show you what that rate limiting factor is, or at a minimum, nudge you in the right direction. Maybe there's a lot of deficiencies in their testing, And now this is really where vertical integration can shine because it's like, all right, well, I see a lot of things they need to work on. Okay, I'm going to touch on all of these qualities, and ideally, it's going to raise kind of all of those buckets, right? And this is where it's like we're always dealing with uncertainty. I'm gonna plug one of my favorite books to you. You know it. I've given it to you to read before, but it's called Thinking in Bets by Annie Duke, and it's you know sh her famous line or the gist of the book is life is poker. It's not chess. Chess, there's always a mathematical correct answer or correct next move to do that's going to lead you to the ultimate goal to win the game. That's not reality. That's not what we're doing when we're working with living human beings that have so many, variables day to day. Life is poker. There are odds that we can play in our favor depending on what we do, but there's always a bit of luck involved. I could have an 80% chance of success, 20% chance of failure. I go and I try that intervention or I try this training program, and there's still a 20% chance that that might fail for whatever reason. The athlete didn't sleep, execution wasn't how it needed to be. They missed a couple training sessions, whatever it is. So we're really just trying to, get the greatest probability, stack the odds in our favor. And that's what, again, when there's uncertainty in what's the best path forward, if our KPIs, all of them are deficient or need some work or for whatever reason, maybe that's unclear, you take a vertical integration approach and now you're really able to um, raise a lot of qualities and you might still get some, good training effects from that. And then maybe you retest and now, your rate limiting factor starts to reveal itself. Ideally we can, attack that right from the get-go. But again, we live in an imperfect world. We might not have all the answers, and we have to be able to still coach and program and do our job through uncertainty. And people always t say it's a science and an art, and that's really where the art comes in. Is being able to make those decisions based on our experiences and the incomplete information that we have.
Well, and this is my last one for you, and you kind of took me right to where I wanted to go to. You mentioned it being like an art, and you know that you and I could do 1500 with fit. I think you and I could go quite a while, but what role, especially the season you're about to go through is a long season. I can imagine for the players, it's repetitive. It can be a little mundane at times, right? What are some of the interpersonal strategies that you use, or what role do you think that plays in longevity and load management, right? Because you get very frequent contact points with your athletes. How much of it do you
Mm.
view that being a role? Is that something you've gotten better at? Is that something you think about? Just talk about that for a couple minutes.
Yeah, I think that's underrated, and it's probably one of the most important parts, is the person, right? Being able to understand, connect with, communicate with the person in front of you, because if you can't do any of those things, like you might have a great, test and battery for your KPIs, a great training program, but like it's not gonna stick. It's not gonna take hold, for one reason or another. I think you fall short if you're not, checking those boxes. So I think that's really, really important. I also think there's a huge power of belief in what you're doing, right? I think the athlete, the team, whoever you're working with, has to, again, you earn people's trust. If you start as strangers, that's one thing. Like those things take time. I don't think you can rush those things. I like to say you can't microwave relationships, right? It's not something that you can just jump in, rush, hey, let's be best friends. I think it just comes from, and this is what I would always preach to my athletes in college. This is something I said to them every day. I just heard one of them repeat it in another interview, which I thought was really cool. When he was giving advice to the younger generation of hoopers. And it's just consistency, right? I think it's consistency in our habits and what we do. I think that something that's underrated with that is like they know what to expect with consistency, right? So if they know what to expect from you, and how you're going to communicate with them, how you're going to approach their training, what certain days are going to look like. I think that's really like a huge underrated value. Um, I think there's a ton of power. I mean, I love the book Atomic Habits. And just like every action we take is a vote for the person we want to be, right? So it's like if you want to get stronger, if you want to be faster, if you want to be a better leader and lead by example, like I think that's your habits. That is like you are your habits. Um, so I think consistency is the biggest piece with that. I think there's a big piece of for like your consistency as a coach and showing up that builds that relationship. Like every time you are, it's like I think there's a time and a place for, big heart-to-heart talks or like motivational techniques. But that's like the whipped cream cherry on top, in my opinion. I think it's simply, casual conversation, showing that you care, like showing empathy. I know we used to have this conversation all the time. I think you know what I'm going to say. It's like one of the most universal things that people can identify and recognize, and I think they appreciate is authenticity. So if
Yep.
you're just like authentically yourself, you authentically care about them as a person, and that you communicate well with them, in throughout the coach athlete relationship, I think that's where you have success. And I think a mediocre program can become a great program just from that. And I think you know if you were to chat GPT the perfect program, I think chat GPT, that's why it's not going to take our job because it can't replace the relationship aspect.
Yeah, man. Yeah, really good. I learned something or a few things or 10 things every time I talk to you still. Everybody be on the lookout for this guy, Alex. You're a rising star. I can't wait to see what you do in the NBA as you continue to develop your career. And I'm excited for you this season. And I know you're a busy guy, so I can't thank you enough for doing this. But unfortunately, I got to let you go. 15 with Fit. Everybody be on the lookout for coming installments of this. I'm excited to run it and talk to some great professionals. They got a lot to live up to after Alex. So thanks very much, dude.
Thanks, Jeff. I appreciate your time, man.